When you start to create models and scenes in 3D Studio Max, you quickly come to the realization that you need to have control of your object's pivot point. What is the pivot point? Every object has its own personal coordinate system, and it's centered on the pivot point. When I select an object, you can see that the XYZ axis shows up on the object at the pivot point. So if I rotate this object, you can see that the object rotates around that pivot point, its own private little coordinate system. If I scale the object, it scales from the pivot point. Again, its own private little coordinate system. And you can move the object too, but you can't really see visually how the pivot point affects the movement. The pivot point does, however, move with the object. If you want to change the pivot point, you need to click on the Hierarchy panel. When you do this, you have access to 3 buttons: Pivot, IK, and Link Info. We're going to be dealing with the Pivot button, the first button. Underneath the Pivot button, there are 2 rollouts in the stack: the Adjust Pivot rollout and the Adjust Transform rollout. Let's take a look at the Adjust Pivot rollout first. There are 3 methods we can use to adjust the pivot point. The first one affects the pivot point only. When I click on this, it becomes active. And you can see that our object, which was selected, its pivot point becomes multicolored. The x-axis becomes red, the y-axis becomes blue, and the z-axis becomes green. Using the Move and Rotate tools, we can move the pivot point, or affect the pivot point, relative to its object. So if I move it down here, turn off the Affect Pivot Point Only button, and rotate, my object rotates around the pivot point based on its new position. If I scale, it scales based on that pivot point's new position. If I click on the Affect Object Only, instead of moving the pivot point, I'm moving the object around its pivot point. The first button lets you move your pivot point and rotate your pivot point around your object, and the second button lets you move your object and rotate your object around your pivot point. This third button lets you affect the hierarchy of objects only. So if you have objects that are linked, like these 3 cylinders in the middle, if I select the parent object and I use the transforms Rotate and Scale, which are the only 2 transforms which work for this button, I can rotate my object's hierarchy You can see I'm rotating the object's hierarchy, not the objects themselves, their hierarchy, or their relationship to each other. Or I can scale the object's hierarchy. I know it's kind of a tough concept to wrap your brain around, but if you play with this a bit, it'll make a little more sense to you. So you're actually affecting the hierarchy of the objects only with these 2 transforms, rotate and scale. Now you'll notice that when I press on these first 2 buttons, my alignment buttons become active. When I click on the third button, they're inactive. So what are these alignment buttons all about? Well, if I have Affect Pivot Only, I can select an object, and you can see my pivot is away from my object. I can actually center the pivot to the object by pressing this first button, and boom, it moves the pivot to the center of the object. Now I can align the pivot to that object by clicking this button, the second button. And now it aligns the pivot to the axis of the object. If I want to align the pivot to the axis of the world coordinate system, or the coordinate system for the whole scene, click on the third button, the Align to World. And it does that. You can see now it's aligned to the world coordinate system. If I select the second button, the Affect Object Only button, now the alignment buttons change a little bit. Now I'm aligning the center of the object to the pivot. So if I move my object off of my pivot, and I click the center to pivot, it moves the object to the pivot so that the pivot is in the center of the object. Now, if I want to align the object to the pivot, I can click the Align to Pivot, and it aligns it to the pivot. So it's lined up in the same way, in the same direction. If I want to rotate this now, I can align my object to the world coordinate system by clicking the bottom button, Align to World. And you can see now that my objects align to the world coordinate system. Now suppose you get yourself into a little bind. Let's say we rotate and move our object and our coordinate system, and we make a huge mess of it in all directions. What do? Well, take the hand tool and move down in the stack a little bit more. We can reset the pivot to its original settings. When I click this button, the pivot goes to its original setting, which was at the bottom of the cylinder, aligned with the object's orientation. Let's scroll down to the Adjust Transform controls now. We'll just move this out of the way. When we have an object in the world, right-click on the Select and Move button, and you can get the Type In transform. So you can type in the transform of your object. You can move your object around with this, or if you move your object around with the cursor, you can see that the absolute world coordinates are recorded here in this box. Now, the alignment of the object can be checked by clicking on the Rotate transform, and you can see also that our object's rotation is recorded here in the absolute world coordinates. If I want to reset these coordinates for this transform or for a scale transform, I can simply click on the Reset Transform button, and it sets my object's coordinate system to 0, 0, 0 in this position. So when I rotate it now, anywhere I rotate away from that reset position, it tells me the angle. I can do the same for scale. If I scale my object, you can see in the absolute local values in my Type-In transform, it saves that information so I know how far off from the original size it is. If I go to a size that I want to keep, and I want to reset this to 0 or to 100%, I can click the Scale Reset, and it'll reset the scale to 100 at that size. So now when I scale it, it's relative to that new reset value. Just move this out of the way. Let's go back to our hierarchy. When I move a hierarchy around, the children follow. This bottom cylinder is the parent. Suppose I want to adjust this parent. How do I do it? Well, under the Adjust Transform, I can click on the Don't Affect Children button. When this is on, I can move a parent, and it doesn't affect the children. I can rotate the parent, and it doesn't affect the children. And I can scale the parent, and it doesn't affect the children objects. If I turn this off, if I rotate the object, the parent object rotates the children as well. If I scale the parent object, it scales the children as well. If I move it, it moves the children as well. So if you want to make adjustments to parents, go to the Hierarchy panel, go to the Pivot button, move down to the Adjust Transform Rollout, click on Don't Affect Children, and you can do whatever you want to the parent, and it won't affect the children objects. So when you're affecting the pivot points of objects, you need to go to the Hierarchy panel and click on the Pivot button, and use the rollouts under here to make the changes that you need.